So with ChatGPT's new image generation model, I wanted to test it out to see how it performs compared to other image generation, such as Nano Banana. So here's a quick preview of what I've created. Creating one good infographic is easy. Creating a consistent series is the real challenge. So across all these DHL designs, you can see that there's the same branding, typography, icon style, spacing, as well as layout. So it actually feels like it's connected as part of a one branded system. And that's the difference between random AI outputs and building scalable branded content with AI. If you ever tried to create infographics for a brand or content, you know some of the challenges in terms of keeping it consistent. So the colors would change, the icons, the style, it all kind of looks a little bit different. So even when the content or design looks good, it doesn't actually feel like it belongs to the same brand. So the key thing here is when you're creating infographic, you're not just asking the model to create the infographic, you're actually providing it with a brief. So think about it like this. So when you're onboarding a new team member, you're not just saying, hey, go and develop this or go and create the infographic. Hopefully you're providing them with some instructions around how to create the infographic around the topic area or process. So ideally you want to give them some guidelines around how to complete the task. So in this video, I'm going to show you the brief that I use and walk you through step by step. Open up a new chat window and select create an image. And here you can type in your prompt. So to begin, I would suggest creating a detailed brief on the brand that you're working on. So here I've created a prompt that works more like a design brief. So instead of just typing in your prompt to create the infographic on, say, a given topic, I've given ChatGPT clear instructions around the brand, the color, typography, icon styles, as well as the overall design direction. So in the first section here, I've got the content input, and this is where I've set the parameters in terms of the layout as well as design. So this just makes it easier to generate the infographics based on a predefined design layout. Now, if you've got some predefined layout that you always want ChatGPT to follow, you can always add it in here. So for an example, you might always want your layout to be in a 2-column or a 3x6 grid layout. You can always specify it in your prompts. The next section is around the system design, and this is where you add in your brand style or guidelines. So in this example, we're going to be using DHL as our use case. So here I've added the color palettes for the DHL yellow, red, black, white, along with some strict rules around how to use the colors. So for an example, yellow should be used as the dominant color, the red should be used sparingly as an accent color, and black for the text and icons, and white as the background. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that even though you provide it with the exact hex code, the color may not always be a perfect match. However, it is very close to the original colors. So the next section is around the typography. So here I've asked it to use a specific font style and use clean body text, short lines, and a maximum of 8 words per line. So this is important when you're creating infographics, as it makes it a lot easier to scan. And if there's too much text or long paragraph, it becomes a lot harder to read and design loses its impact. And then I've added some details around the icon system design, and this is where it's most important part. So I've told ChatGPT that all the icons must use a consistent style and the same color treatment and using the same stroke weight. Now, one of the most common issues around creating infographics is around inconsistent icons, where some are filled, some are outlined, and others have different colors. So this section helps to prevent that and keeps everything visually aligned. In the next section under visual style, so here I've described the overall look and feel. So in terms of the infographic that I'm after, I want it to be minimal, corporate, clean spacing with high readability and a balanced layout. So I'm not trying to control every single design decision here, but I still want ChatGPT to act like a designer and choose the best layout based on the content, but still stay within a consistent structure as well as follow the brand guidelines. And just to add to this, I've added some creative direction where I've given it a bit more flexibility. So I've asked it to group the information, new sections, grids, or flows where appropriate, and to focus on clarity, consistency, as well as ease of reading. Now, this is important because not every infographic is the same. So some topics might be better as a process flow, others might be grouped into sections. This allows ChatGPT to work within the existing design and adapt it to ensure that it's consistent. Now, depending upon your use case, if you're using this for social media content, I've added here a call to action rule, which tells ChatGPT to only include it where it fits naturally within the content. The other thing that I've added here is around the validation check or a QA process for ChatGPT to use before generating the image. So this covers things like icons, image, layout, typography, and the overall brand consistency. Now this doesn't guarantee a perfect result, but it significantly improves the output by forcing the model to check its own work before finalizing the image. Once the brief is set up and you've added that to ChatGPT, at the end here I've just added a simple prompt to create an infographic about the track and trace process, and this is what it's generated. Now overall the results is pretty good. The layout is clean, the process is easy to follow, and it's visually close to the DHL brand guidelines that we provided it before. And as mentioned, the colors are not an exact match, however it is very close, and the content is generated based on general information, so you need to validate the details if you're looking for something a little bit more specific. Alternatively, within the prompt, you could specify exactly what you're after in terms of the process, as well as the details within that process. And now if you need to edit the image, you can select on the one tool here, and you can highlight the area that you want to change. So for an example, let's just highlight this location icon here. And for testing purposes, I'm going to ask ChatGPT to change the color to red and do not fill in the middle of the circle. And you can see here that ChatGPT has made those changes. Now this works well for minor changes such as adjusting colors of small elements, but it's not reliable for major changes because it regenerates parts of the image rather than preserving the original image. Next, we're going to change the aspect ratio to portrait while keeping the design similar. To change the size of the image, click on the aspect ratio button. So in this example here, we're going to select portrait. Now what you will notice that when you change the aspect ratio, and you can see here that the colors change. Now one of the key things to keep in mind is that although ChatGPT has changed the aspect ratio, it's obviously changed the design, but you'll also notice here that it's changed the actual color of the icons. So this is something to be aware of, and it's always best to predefine your aspect ratio before generating the image, rather than using it to simply resize it. So with the next prompt, I'm going to create a new infographic, and this time we're going to test to see whether I can maintain the same style for another topic. So this time I'm going to ask it to create an infographic for different services. So this is where the brief becomes really helpful, because instead of starting from scratch, it can reuse the same design system and layout and update the content. And based on our second image that we've created, it does have the same consistent look and feel as the original image. And then it's really up to your imagination in terms of what you want to create. So in the next example, we're going to create an infographic based on the annual report results for 2025. So initially I asked ChatGPT to use the report and generate some key highlights that I could use for the infographic, and this is what it's created. Now I do like the overall design and consistency of the image generation. However, when it comes to the image itself, it's not always accurate in terms of the branding. So if we look at the truck here, as compared to the images that's available online, it's not necessarily matching the actual branding on the truck. And also when you zoom in on the image, you also start to notice some inconsistency around the image. So here we have an image of an MHE, which doesn't really look like an MHE that we would have in the real world. Now, if you want the infographic to include an image, I would suggest starting with a real image and ask ChatGPT to overlay the image with some text and content. So overall, if you want consistent branded infographic, just make sure you start off with a brief, give it some rules around the color, typography, design, and also add in that validation process. Now, it won't always be perfect and you need to check the details. As with any image generation, it will give you the best chance and save you a lot of time in terms of creating consistent branded infographics. Now, let me know in the comments below what you're going to be creating next, and I'll catch you next time. Bye for now.